I was quite surprised to hear from Professor Sharma just now how many Indian company directors have been put into jail. I cannot recall any director of note who is in jail in Australia at the moment. This may be because even our regulators and ethics advisors cannot always tell right from wrong. I suggest in my presentation that the reason for this is that our culture has been poisoned by us blindly adopting English corporate governance codes and practices. Before I begin my presentation, I'd like to recognize the robust intellectual leadership provided by Professor Sharma in hosting this webinar to share even more radical thoughts. Relevant to the need for radical reform is the fact that we both reside in former English colonies. Corporations evolved as a technique for English sovereigns to privatize the cost of colonization and empire building. Unlike India or Australia, the US decolonized with their War of Independence. To avoid recolonization in the 18th and 19th century, US state governments limited the rights to incorporate to only local citizens and only for a limited time of 20 years or less. In addition, corporate charters could be cancelled if a corporation created harms. This is an excellent idea to consider radical reform, but I'll not be so radical. However, I'd like to point out that all intellectual property rights are time limited. Corporations are an exception. This exception was not created for commercial reasons. It was for political purposes. For example, the Corporation of London can trace its history back to 1067. This is when William the Conqueror provided a royal charter for the citizens of London to govern themselves. They had done so for the previous centuries. Charters to authorize self-government of universities naturally had perpetual ambitions. So did charters, of course, that funded colonization. In the 18th century, common law domestic enterprises were formed in Europe. These also had limited life. To provide limited liability to investors, they were issued bearer shares. This meant that the owners could not be identified to become liable. Owners and controllers of the business protected from liability by forming a supervisory board. In this way, they were not directly involved as business partners incurring any liabilities. Limited life is the general rule for business people. This is because productive assets wear out and or they become obsolete. As a serial entrepreneur, I've raised substantial sums of money to fund new ventures. I funded 2 public companies with property rights for their investors being limited to 15 years. For funding films, we used a shorter time to avoid excessive administration costs after the expected investor payback period. Many professional and institutional investors accept limited life investments. This is demonstrated by their investment in government infrastructure projects. After the private investors have funded, built and operated a project, ownership is transferred to the government at no cost, a process used over the past centuries to fund toll roads and canals. The systemic problems with unlimited life corporations is that it allows investors to get overpaid in a way that accounting doctrines cannot report. I describe such overpayments as surplus profits. This is because economists do not have a word to describe profits in excess of the incentive to invest. Economists think I'm referring to what they refer to in their jargon as economic rent. However, unlike surplus profits, accountants do report so-called economic rents. Different ideas need different words. This reveals why high-profile economists like Thomas Piketty cannot understand how corporations can overpay investors to generate a major hidden source of inequality. What is not reported cannot be managed or taxed. One economist who's recognized the problem was Professor Edith Penrose. She pointed out that direct investment resulted in the acceptance of unlimited, unknown, and uncontrollable foreign liability. Overpaying alien investors in perpetuity represents economic vandalism. This depletes the wealth of towns, regions, and host nations. It also frustrates self-governance, and so the ability to protect and nurture host environments. This makes no sense economically, politically, or environmentally. It provides an important case for radical reform. Reform would improve the economic, political, and environmental attractions of capitalism. However, improving capitalism is not nearly as important as sustaining humanity on our planet for eternity. Transforming existing corporations to follow the laws of nature with limited life provides numerous shorter-term benefits. One is the ability to attract more foreign investment with a competitive profit, but on a basis that phases out alien ownership and control. Evolution of our species depends upon rebirth and adaptation. This allows us to survive and thrive in complex, dynamic, unknowable environments. Today, global warming is creating an urgent need for corporations to not just adapt, but to counter this wicked problem. Wicked problems arise when the self-interest of individuals or groups have incentives to overexploit common life-sustaining resources so that none remains from anyone. This wicked problem is described as the tragedy of the commons. Corporations have the potential to be a common good. However, the self-interest of shareholders and executives can deny benefits being shared with other stakeholders. This creates a compelling and urgent case for radically reforming corporate governance, but this need not jeopardize shareholder primacy. My theme for this presentation is that we need to learn from nature so humanity can exist eternally with nature. This presentation is limited to corporate reforms, but the laws of nature also have relevance for transforming the ownership and control of real estate and money. Ecological ownership introduces the idea of use it or lose it, while ecological control describes a special type of network governance found in resilient, stakeholder-governed enterprises. It's also found in non-profit and civic associations. Ecological forms of governance are capable of avoiding the tragedy of the commons by squaring the circle to provide benefits to all stakeholders, not just shareholders. This is what Larry Fink requested in his 2018 letter to the CEOs of the companies in which he has investments. Fink is the CEO of the largest asset manager in the world. His letter went to other CEO members of the very influential US Business Roundtable. 180 of them also announced in their 2019 their commitment to provide benefits to all their stakeholders. This objective would convert corporations into becoming a common good. Global common good corporations would then become obliged to promote global common goods. These would include reducing pollution, inequality, and countering global warming. This provides a political basis for street protesters to rebel against climate change to form an alliance with the captains of industry. However, achieving this result means that overcoming shareholders' conflict of interest is also sharing their benefits with other stakeholders. Elinor Ostrom identified how both pre-modern and modern traditional societies avoided such wicked problems by establishing a system of self-governance. As a political scientist, Ostrom described their self-governing architecture in the language of her discipline as possessing polycentric republics. Ostrom shared the Nobel Prize for her work. Ironically, she shared the prize with Oliver Williamson, who limited his research to hierarchical firms and markets. Neither economic markets nor hierarchies are required for self-governance. Self-governance has been my research instrument since before writing my 1975 book, on democratizing the wealth of nations. In 2002, the London-based New Economics Foundation commissioned me to write one of their public policy booklets. They were seeking an alternative solution to government ownership or Thatcher privatization. My answer was self-governing stakeholder ownership and control. Self-governance is my definition for sound governance. In this way, the size and cost of governments and taxes can be minimized. Democracy is enriched on an inclusive bottom-up basis. This supplements traditional top-down approaches. Unfortunately, modern education covertly assumes that top-down management is the natural order of things, an assumption encouraged by political dictators, bureaucrats, many company directors, as well as monarchists. Command and control hierarchies are inherently unable to become self-governing. Part of the explanation requires understanding the laws of nature. Engineers and scientists possess this knowledge on how to design self-governing automobiles and Mars exploration vehicles. Before sharing the insights of the science of governance, I'd like to explain that I only became aware of Ostrom's work 17 years after I'd completed my PhD degree. My research topic was the governance of firms with more than one board, theory development and examples. It was exciting to recognize that my dissertation contained 3 examples of firms that met Ostrom's test of forming polycentric republics. They provided persuasive role models of how elements of ecological governance could be introduced into existing firms that, as I will share later. One case study was a UK employee-controlled the John Lewis Partnership. It is a major retail firm with over 80,000 employees. Many stores possess their own locally constitutionally established decision-making committees. These almost self-governing republics are established as polycentric units within the group. Polycentric republics are also formed within the nested lateral and vertical networks of multi-stakeholder controlled cooperatives based around the town of Mondragon in Spain. In the US, the Visa credit card company has created polycentric republics by each shareholder member bank forming its own board within a common corporate entity. As a result, Visa, like Mondragon and the John Lewis Partnership, possess hundreds of boards. Member banks of Visa compete with each other but cooperate in the promotion of their common credit card. Competition and cooperation is a defining feature of ecological governance. This established both a basis and a facility for entities to negotiate win-win outcomes to avoid tragedies from common interests. I unwittingly introduced polycentric republics in 1978 when I wrote new constitutions for 2 national non-profit Australian organisations. One was the Company Directors Association of Australia that became the Australian Institute of Company Directors. The other was the Australian Controlling Body for Skiing. Each had self-governing state bodies. The process of federating them into a national body had the effect of creating polycentric republics. While state republics might compete with each other within the nation, they would cooperate nationally to promote their common interests. The most compelling insight to support ecological governance is that polycentric republics create a pattern that is also found in physics, chemistry, genetics, biology, anatomy, astronomy, engineering, science, and software design. These are tabulated in table 3.8 of my PhD thesis, which is available on the web. It is for this reason I refer to polycentric republics as ecological governance. It is a form that also describes human neural networks that are used to simplify complexity. This explains why software engineers also simplify complexity this way. Simplifying complexity is a fundamental problem of company directors. It provides yet another compelling reason for introducing radical reform of corporate governance. Our brains have no chief executive neuron. Decision-making is distributed, to reduce data processing overload in any one region beyond the capacity of our neural networks to process. Different areas of our brains make different types of decisions according to our physiological, psychological, and environmental context. Ecological governance would introduce similar competitive advantages in social institutions to reduce information overload. My PhD dissertation describes the specific details of how decision-making labor of a unitary board can be distributed throughout an organization. Figure 7.1 of my thesis shows the functions and activities of a unitary board as described by Bob Tricker. Tricker wrote the first textbook called Corporate Governance and became one of my PhD examiners. The figure shows that the main role of a board is appointing and rewarding the CEO. There are 4 other roles divided into conformance and performance functions. Both these are divided into external and internal domains. Figure 7.2 show how these 5 functions are taken over by 5 different boards that include all employees of the firm. Figure 7.3 indicates the data processing load of individuals is distributed through all employees. In this way, the information processing becomes a fraction of that required by a handful of directors of a unitary board. Other stakeholder-governed firms have different ways of decomposing decision-making labor. A defining feature of ecological governance is that it introduces a yin and or yang duality in behavior of organizations. It also facilitates the inherent duality of individual behavior that it exploits to promote self-governance. Hierarchies typically do not tolerate contrary and or complementary behavior. But this explains why scholars neglect this reality. An example of neglect is an article of Jensen and Meckling on the nature of man. They identified 5 models. None recognize that human nature is subject to contextual change, a point raised by Melbourne professor of psychology, Alex Waring. Waring explains that humans are, to quote, sometimes competitive, sometimes collaborative, usually both, end of quote. Also, a human, to quote, stands in an interactive cybernetic relationship to his or her community and environment and is changed as a result of that interaction. Cybernetics was defined in the last century as the science of control and communication in man and machine. This century, its scope has been extended to include social organizations of any species. In this way, cybernetics has become the science of governance. It's also a component of system science. This extension was made possible by using bits or bytes as a unit of analysis. No collective action can be established within or between species without the transactions of bytes. In this way, transaction byte analysis subsumes transaction cost economics developed by Oliver Williamson. The Williamson approach deals with social constructs not subject to being metered. Bytes are routinely metered in many of our electronic devices. Modern technology has opened up a huge uncharted domain for fundamental and rigorous corporate governance research. Perhaps this could be of interest to the Global Research Foundation. The cybernetic law of requisite variety explains why DNA hardwires social animals like ourselves to possess contrary and or complementary behavior. This type of behavior is replicated in the physical world of electrons, protons, or sunlight that behaves like both radiation and as particles. It is by combining contrary and or complementary behavior that new characteristics emerge from the tensional integrity created. Buckminster Fuller combined these words to create the word tensegrity. Fuller's geodetic domes allow the greatest area to be covered by the least material. In a similar way, tensegrity allows DNA to use the least material to program the maximum variety of behavior into creatures to allow them to learn how to survive and thrive in complex, unknowable, dynamic environments. Likewise, social organizations be they in the public, private, or non-profit sectors, can use tensegrity to improve their ability to survive and thrive in complex, unknowable, dynamic environments. In the non-profit sector, tensegrity could improve economy, efficiency, and effectiveness. In addition, democracy is enriched on a bottom-up basis by ecological organizations involving all citizens in their governance architecture. The need to use the least material in DNA is because bytes are embedded in material and/or energy. Minimizing data minimizes materials and energy required by living things. The importance of this is illustrated by the human brain. While our brains may only represent 2% of our body weight, they consume 20% of body energy, even when resting. Harvard cell biologist Donald Ingber describes tensegrity as, to quote, the architecture of life. Quantum physicist David Bohm considers that dual properties as a feature of the universe. I see tensegrity as both a way to manage complexity and a driver of complexity. I suspect that tensegrity is the driving force of evolution, with future evolution dependent upon any new emergent entities reproducing dual characteristics. The social tensions created by tensegrity maintain a process of constant challenge and correction of communication, control, and decision-making. Such processes are inhibited, denied, or punished in command and control hierarchies. Tensegrity introduces systemic process for cross-checking communication data, control compliance, and errors in decision-making. All these features are missing in the dominant forms of modern institutions that rely on simple command and control hierarchies. Tensegrity introduces a crucial safeguard for managers and their directors to avoid living in a cocoon of ignorance concerning mismanagement, misconduct, and malfeasance. Australian Royal Commissions have revealed that often individuals can be ignorant of what is right or what is wrong. It seems to be a systemic problem in hierarchical institutions. There have been 5 recent commissions to inquire into banking, child sexual abuse, protection of children in detention, exploitation of people with disability, and of aged care institutions. The investigations involve hierarchies in listed companies, private companies, non-profit organizations, government-controlled organizations, and even churches and schools. The relevant regulators were also organized as hierarchies. The Royal Commission revealed how regulators could compound problems. Their impotence was due to their shared English-speaking culture of not knowing what was right or wrong. The very purpose for developing a hierarchical organization is to simplify complexity and/or reduce information overload. But this requires information passing upwards through workers to directors. So information needs to be both reduced and simplified through each level of the chain of command. Just how dangerous it can become is illustrated by the party game of having 2 teams of, say, 5 people competing to accurately relay an identical message. Often the message reported by each team can be quite different. In a command and control hierarchy, compelling incentives exist to bias or omit news that could reflect on the reputation, bonus, or continued employment of the messenger. Bad news can travel very slowly or not at all. Let us make the generous assumption that up to 50% of the information available at one level is transmitted upwards through 5 levels of a hierarchy. Even if there were no errors, this reduces the information available to directors to only around 3%. If we allow 50% of the information becoming biased, distorted, or wrong at each level, then missing or wrong information in the message obtained by the board rises to over 98%. I hope this points raised so far suggest to corporate governance scholars and also to practitioners that it would be a promising idea to introduce tensegrity into corporations. Without it, directors are not protected. Existing examples of ecological corporations illustrate how tensional integrity could be systemically introduced into the control and communication architecture within organizations and between organizations and their stakeholders. To establish genuine tension, conflicts of interest need to be constructively formalized and focused. In hierarchies, the opposite occurs, or simply ignored, or fester to create toxicity. An example of how to introduce hardwired tensegrity is provided by the citizen utility boards established in the United States. These were initiated in the 1970s by Ralph Nader to protect consumers from privately owned regulated monopoly suppliers of electricity, gas, and water utilities. Citizen utility boards employ professional advocates to connect regulatory capture, to counter regulatory capture by their supplier. They could also act as whistleblowers if the supplier introduced predatory or unconscionable conduct. The citizen boards were financed by customer donations. They still exist today to provide evidence that customers believe that they provide value for money. To improve the self-governing potential of publicly traded firms, one fundamental requirement is to remove toxic governance. As a serial entrepreneur, this improved my ability to raise high-risk funding that may not otherwise be forthcoming. No changes in the law was required, only the approval of shareholders to change the corporate constitution. Without a separation of powers to manage the business from the power to govern the corporation, directors are exposed to manifold unethical systemic conflicts of self-interest. A European type of superannuation board does not remove all conflicts as they indirectly possess both types of powers. Directors of the supervisory board, like those of a unitary board, have absolute power to identify and manage their own conflicts of interest to absolutely corrupt themselves, the business, and society. There is no ethical commercial reason why directors should possess excessive powers. Bob Monks and Alan Sykes spelled out details in their 2002 publication, Capitalism Without Owners Will Fail, A Policymaker's Guide to Reform. It is common practice for venture capitalists to invest in startup companies on condition that shareholders agree to transfer many of their governance powers to the venture capitalist. These powers could involve the appointment and remuneration of the directors and auditors, payment of dividends, issuing new shares, making major new investments and or borrowings, chairing the annual general meeting, controlling proxies, and counting the votes. None of these activities are needed to manage the business. All these activities create distractions for managers. It just not make sense for managers to undertake both roles. Nor does it make much sense for an outside venture capitalist or their nominated advisors to manage a new business or new technology which they may possess little knowledge or authority to direct. In analyzing the failure of internal control systems, Michael Jensen pointed out how the separation of powers introduced in leveraged buyout associations represent, to quote, proven models of corporate structure, end of quote. Jensen went on to say that leveraged buyout associations and venture funds also solve many of the informational problems facing typical boards of directors. Other scholars have also recommended a separation of powers, like Lynn Dallas, Meyer and Meyerson, David Hatherley, and my PhD supervisor, James Guthrie. As a practicing serial entrepreneur, I have on 2 occasions introduced contractual arrangements for my shareholders to appoint, remunerate, and control my auditor. To attract investors on both occasions, these watchdog boards were elected on the basis of 1 vote per investor, rather than 1 vote per unit of investment. In this way, plutocracy was held in check by democracy. It also introduced tensegrity. In one startup venture, I described the watchdog board as a corporate senate. This is because its powers were limited to only voting any actions in which any director could have conflict of interest. Only a senator could chair an annual general meeting at which directors were being held accountable. The arrangements inspired a senator in the Australian Parliament to recommend that all publicly traded corporations in Australia establish a stronger version of my model that he more properly described as a corporate governance board. While the proposal was not adopted in Australia, a number of European companies have separate elected audit committees, even if they possess a supervisory board. This arrangement failed in 2002 to prevent the fraud and collapse of the Italian company Parmalat. Failure occurred because the watchdog board was elected on a plutocratic basis. This allowed the major shareholder, who was also the CEO, to control all three boards, provide evidence of how power corrupts absolutely. I'm constantly astounded how good people like Sir Adrian Cadbury do not recognize the unethical conflicts of directors' self-interest that are systemically inherent in unitary boards. Some that do recognize them show little concern. Regulators are in case in point. Misnamed so-called prudential regulators typically force additional unethical conflicts on bank directors. This arises from requiring financial institutions to appoint an audit committee of directors instead of a committee of shareholders. Over the years of meeting Sir Adrian Cadbury at various conferences, he began to inquire how a governance board would work. So I think he began to realize what a terrible mistake his 1992 committee had made. The Cadbury Code ignored the optional model constitution provided in the UK Companies Act of 1862. This model provided for shareholders to form audit committees. The model was consistent with the 1845 Companies Clauses Act that required shareholders to appoint one of their numbers to be an auditor. The UK Treasury paid for the audit costs to assure audit independence. The company then reimbursed the government. Cadbury also failed to recognize that audit committees were established in the US before the SEC was created to protect investors, not shareholders or investors. Directors require protection for managers breaking loan agreements that could make directors personally liable. Another failure of the Cadbury Committee was it did not recognize that the House of Lords in 1990 ruled that the Caparo case, that the UK audit was to provide, and I quote, intelligence to members, end of quote, to make decisions on electing, rewarding, and or dismissing directors. In other words, it was a governance audit. The SEC Act of 1934 had copied the prospectus audit provisions of the 1929 UK Companies Act. So the US audit is for investors. The role of the UK auditor is to judge the accounts of the directors. No judge in a court of law would accept the untenable conflict of interest of judging those who paid the judge. In this way, corporate governance codes promoting director instead of shareholder audit committees have poisoned the ethics of the English-speaking world. Another source of good people accepting unethical practices is when corporate constitutions give priority for directors to chair and so control the annual general meeting at which they are accountable. Auditing standards provide yet another example of systemic blindness to unethical conflicts. The definition of independence is so narrow that in practice it allows auditors to lie. Stock exchanges provide another example of self-serving ethical blindness. A fundamental rule in the financial services industry is to know the identity of your client and who you are dealing with. However, stock exchanges keep secret the identity of whom you are trading with. The identity could be price-sensitive information, or maybe just your own broker acting covertly. If investors want to keep their wealth private, then they should not invest in public companies. It is misleading describing corporations as being public when they do not make public complete details of their ultimate ownership and control. Full disclosure would create sunlight share trading to disinfect unethical dealings, money laundering, terrorist financing, double dealing by stockbrokers, dark pools, and insider trading. Sunlight trading would eliminate the need to use third-party exchanges. Companies could trade their own shares like the Australian Stock Exchange does. Non-listed firms with employee ownership routinely undertake to trade their own shares. There are more such firms in the US than companies listed on the New York Stock Exchange. Capitalism is riddled with self-serving conflicts that are promoted as good governance. As noted by Australian Royal Commissioners, It has created a business culture that cannot recognize what is right and what is wrong. All these systemic toxic problems could be removed or mitigated with ecological firms. The transformation of hierarchical corporations into ecological organizations could be achieved in stages and by various means. These are described in my related conference paper on which this talk is based. It is important to note that the existence of ecological firms mentioned earlier in the US, UK, and Europe means that no changes in the law are required. However, to accelerate the opportunity to counter climate change, I'd recommend that tax incentives that would raise more revenues than they could cost. A self-funding incentive could be created by offering corporations a conditional lower level of tax, like is commonly provided to cooperatives. The condition is that they would issue new shares to their citizen stakeholders. As citizens can pay tax at a higher rate than corporations, the government would increase their revenues to make the incentive self-financing. The incentive for shareholders to prove endowing a requisite variety of their stakeholders with equity would be that their company would obtain a higher profit sooner with less risk. Such endowment corporations would also create a process to fund a universal well-being income. I described this as a social dividend in my 1975 book, Democratizing the Wealth of Nations. Both my book and my related conference paper for this talk can be downloaded from the Social Science Network. My conference paper is on managing the complexity of climate change. It identifies 20 ways in which hierarchies can produce toxic outcomes. It also indicates how these can be eliminated or mitigated by introducing elements of ecological governance. Simplistic generic elements of how to begin the transformation of publicly traded corporations are presented in Figure 1 as shown. There are two crucial changes introduced by ecological governance. The first is that shareholders elect two boards, one to manage the business, the other to govern the corporation. This introduces tensegrity by formally establishing contestable decision-making. The second change is the introduction of polycentric republics in the form of self-appointed stakeholder advisory boards. These generate additional tensegrity by providing feedback to the shareholders independently of management if they are obtaining benefits. Only 4 types are suggested on the left-hand side of the figure. They are employee assemblies, supplier forums, customer councils, and community committees. In practice, many more may be required to represent various constituencies of stakeholders and/or various geographic areas. It should be noted that shareholder primacy is preserved. This means that shareholders become accountable for their corporations becoming a common good for society. It also means that in endowment corporations, citizen stakeholders become accountable as shareholders rather than faceless institutional investors. Democracy becomes enriched from the bottom up to assist in compelling our political leaders to counter global warming. Democracy is also enriched by the size of endowment firms being limited to human scale. Growth can only be achieved through dividend reinvestment plans used to fund offspring enterprises. These provide succession and growth processes for all stakeholders. In my related presentation, I've identified 5 stages and/or ways for introducing and testing how toxic, undemocratic governance can be replaced with ecological processes. Unfortunately, publicly traded firms have been provide role models for private firms and non-profits and government organizations. All sectors require reform if we are to redesign the power structures of society to establish locally self-governing global communities to counter wicked problems like climate change. During the last century, both the US and UK announced countless laws, regulations, and codes for unitary boards, repeatedly trying to fix something that is unworkable again and again is widely accepted as proof of insanity. An urgent need is for academics to develop research and teaching of ecological governance Practitioners need to learn the theory and practice of building local self-governing institutions that can survive and thrive in internally sustainable circular economies. Various ways of introducing ecological governed society will require evaluation and analysis of what works best where. To accelerate the transformation initiatives and to create exemplars for others to adopt, I would encourage annual awards to be made for the most outstanding initiatives in introducing elements of ecological governance. Awards could be made in, say, 4 divisions. These would be for publicly traded firms, private corporations, non-profit organizations, and government organizations. The most innovative and exemplary practices may already exist in non-profit and private organizations. For this reason, they could be excused from paying an entry fee. However, considerable research and auditing resources would be required to launch the program. I would very much welcome hearing from any potential sponsors or suggestions as who could be approached. I have developed criteria for making such awards based on my PhD research. The criteria, I used this criteria when I was a member of a judging panel, ranking reputation of the largest 100 organizations by turnover in Australia. Not all were publicly traded. Let me end this presentation with some of the simple take-home messages. My first is that corporate charters become toxic if they do not introduce a separation of powers. The second is that organizations without a requisite variety of independent feedback channels from stakeholders lack both operating resiliency and social accountability. Lastly, directors and their shareholders have a responsibility to craft corporate charters that minimize control and communication risk by ensuring that they obtain a requisite variety of independent stakeholders' feedback. This is required to obtain assurances that their organization does no harm and poses no social costs or risks while promoting fairness, equity, and democracy. I believe with my co-authors that to counter climate change, humanity needs to integrate the practices of nature into our social institutions. Dee Hock achieved this awesome task as the founding CEO of Visa in 1970. He also unwittingly introduced tensegrity. Hock described Visa as chaotic. He created the word by combining the word chaos and order. Hock explained that, and I quote, industrial age, hierarchical command and control pyramids of power, whether political, social, educational, or commercial, were aberrations of the industrial age, antithetical to the human spirit, destructive of the biosphere, and structurally contrary to the whole history and methods of biological evolution. They are not only archaic and increasingly irrelevant, they were a public menace, end of quote. I believe the menace of global warming can be countered by humanity adopting the governance architecture of nature. Might any of you care to provide support in this regard? I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much.